back to it. So here, for instance, what I can do is on the wall piece, which is nice and plain and simple, I can go to my material settings here, go to my materials, and I'm going to have a back and a front or an in and an out. We're almost there. We've got this big slab on the floor. That's our image. I'm going to hide that out of the way as well. And I'm just going to mock up a simple room now. We do need a floor. I want a floor. So let's go ahead, Shift and S, cursor to the world origin. I'm going to add in a plane. In edit mode, I'm going to scale it by 2, so it's another 4x4 grid. I'm going to add a modifier, which will just be solidify. And I'm going to set that to 0.2. Okay, so that's just a floor piece. Unfortunately, it solidified it in the right direction, so we don't need to do much else. Okay, the origin of this piece and its name. It's probably just called plane at the moment. Let's call it floor. Let's put it nested within the building. That's good. Okay, I like that. Let's change the position of the origin for it. Shift S, cursor to selected, into object mode, set origin to the 3D cursor, and then we'll move it to 0, 0. Okay, and I'm going to set that to 0.2. Okay, so that's just a floor piece. Unfortunately, it solidified it in the right direction, so we don't need to do much else. Okay, the origin of this piece and its name. It's probably just called plane at the moment. Let's call it floor. Let's put it nested within the building. That's good. Okay, I like that. Let's change the position of the origin for it. Shift S, cursor to selected, into object mode, set origin to the 3D cursor, and then we'll move it to 0, 0. Okay. Now, one of the things to bear in mind is because we are using the origin as the way of positioning, you've got to imagine everything having a front and a back to it. So here, for instance, what I can do is on the wall piece, which is nice and plain and simple, I can go to my material settings here, go to my materials, and I'm going to have a back and a front or an in and an out. So a material and another material, two materials. I'm going to call one out and one in. Now, why am I doing this? Well, it'll become clear when we actually get to modifying and building our scene. So I'm just going to make this one here. No, let's just make it a darker color. So outside is darker, inside is lighter. Absolutely fine, and I can share these materials on everything. So let's go into edit mode, select one of the walls. I'm going to call this the in wall. So here, for instance, okay, I like that. Let's change the position of the origin for it. Shift S, cursor to selected, into object mode, set origin to the 3D cursor, and then we'll move it to 0, 0. Okay. Now, one of the things to bear in mind is because we are using the origin as the way of positioning, you've got to imagine everything having a front and a back to it. So here, for instance, what I can do is on the wall piece, which is nice and plain and simple, I can go to my material S, cursor to selected, into object mode, set origin to the 3D cursor, and then we'll move it to 0, 0. Okay. Now, one of the things to bear in mind is because we are using the origin as the way of positioning, you've got to imagine everything having a front and a back to it. So here, for instance, what I can do is on the wall piece, which is nice and plain and simple, I can go to my material settings here, go to my materials, and I'm going to have a back and a front or an in and an out. So a material and another material, two materials. I'm going to call one out and one in. Now, why am I doing this? Well, it'll become clear when we actually get to modifying and building our scene. So I'm just going to make this one here. No, let's just make it a darker color. So outside is darker, inside is lighter. Absolutely fine, and I can share these materials on everything. So let's go into edit mode, select one of the walls. I'm going to call this the in wall, assign. So this is just the face there, and I'm going to select the other face of my wall and assign it the out color. Okay, I'm going to hide that out of the way. I'm going to select my window. I'm going to hide the others as well. I'm going to go into edit mode. I'm going to select these two faces here, assign them in. I'm going to select these two faces here and sign them out. New material, assign it out. Make sure you click on assign. Yeah, those are all assigned. What else do we need to do? Well, the floor doesn't matter. There's no in and out for that, but just this doorway here. So let's go into edit mode, select this face here, new material, assign it in. And again, here, this this face, new material, assign it the out material, click assign, and we should. Has that been assigned? Let's just make sure. Oh, who's changed the color of out? There we go. Dark and light. Make sure that applies on the other dark and light. Dark and light. Perfect. Okay. So the reason why I've color coded them like that is now we have our simple mesh objects that we can rearrange. I can start making myself a building. So let's start with a rough floor plan here. So in object mode, I'm going to select my floor piece here. I'm going to look at it from the top, and I'm just going to use Alt and D. So if I make any other changes to my model, I can easily apply them. I can hold down Control and Snap if I wanted to, or I could just turn on snapping. And this is where Absolute Grid Snap may be really useful. The reason why I've created everything 4x4, well, it's so they snap perfectly within a grid, and that won't happen unless you have Absolute Grid Snap turned on. Okay, and I'm going to do the same here. I'm going to duplicate it again, make it a little bit of a long room, maybe with... how about the shape of a cross? That's absolutely fine. I don't want to do much more than that, simply for my own sanity more than anything else. So then we have a window here. Remember, we had an inside and an outside of Absolute Grid Snap turned on. Okay, and I'm going to do the same here, snapping. And this is in object mode. I'm going to select my floor piece here. I'm going to look at it from the top, and I'm just going to use Alt and D. So if I make any other changes to my model, I can easily apply them. I can hold down Control and Snap if I wanted to, or I could just turn on snapping. And this is where Absolute Grid Snap may be really useful. The reason why I've created everything 4x4, well, it's so they snap perfectly within a grid, and that won't happen unless you have Absolute Grid Snap turned on. Okay, and I'm going to do the same here. I'm going to duplicate it again, make it a little bit of a long room, maybe with... how about the shape of a cross? That's absolutely fine. I don't want to do much more than that, simply for my own sanity more than anything else. So then we have a window here. Remember, we had an inside and an outside. Now look at how it overlaps the floor piece here. We don't necessarily want that. In fact, this floor piece here, I'm going to duplicate one more and pop it on the outside. So let's start with this window and just move it out of the way. G, Y, pull it down there for a second. In fact, we can pop that right at the very end as well. Notice how that now makes the wall itself. Notice how that will make the room 4x4. But when it comes to actually snapping, if I was to duplicate that again and rotate it on its z-axis by -90, it fits the room perfectly. However, if I was to duplicate it again and try and plop it in, it will kind of match up perfectly here, but it infringes on the room. So once again, rotating it on the z-axis by 180 will enable us to put it in the right location. And look at that, now the floor is perfect, and everything that's on the inside is supposed to be on the inside. Okay, where's our standard wall piece? Let's have a couple of wall pieces in here as well. In fact, you're going to watch me now. I'm just going to speed up the video ever so slightly. I'm just moving things around. You're not going to miss much. So rotate this one by 90 on the z-axis. Okay, so there we go. We can see that I flipped around into a vertical view so I could see my world just that little bit better. I'm happy. For some reason, I've forgotten to put in a wall piece just here as well. Remember, in order to see these properly, you're going to have to be in materials. I think I must have just moved it. So duplicate. Perfect. Okay, so before we crack on, I just need to rotate this around, don't I, as well? Before we crack on, one of the things we need to have a brief look at here is the fact that whilst we've managed to snap everything there, and we've got the wrong... Look, we've got the wrong origin point for this particular model. Should really be in the corner here, and we can see it's misaligned because of that. So let's sort that out now. Well, actually, I'll just sort it out in the main model over here in the export scene. Otherwise, it's going to be so easy to forget. So with the doorway selected, got the lower corner. Okay, so the doorway does have the right origin point by the looks of it. It just happens to be that when we joined everything together, it ended up inheriting some other origin point. Absolutely fine. Just need something to watch out for there. Okay, so we've built our building up here. Looks pretty awesome. We could even have a look at it in rendered mode if you really wanted to see how light and shadow will change. If you went ahead, grab this light source here and popped it behind one of the windows, how would the shadows look coming in through the windows? Let's lower it down as well. Lots of fun that can be had here. And of course, if you're playing with light like that, I would very much recommend using cycles rather than Eevee. just as the first pass, and of course putting a roof on it so there's no environmental leaking into the scene. Or indeed, if you go to the world properties and turn the color down to black, then we are just looking at the lights that's being produced by this point light source. So in this particular case, if we were changing it over to cycles, switch over to the GPU so it's a bit quicker, and we can see there that's got a completely different look to it. In fact, one of the things that will be brilliant is switching over to flying mode. If we go to the view menu and go to navigation, scroll down here, I don't like fly, but I do like walk. We can then use the WASD keys to move around the scene, and we can even turn on gravity as well. We can see that that's the tab key. I can fall down, and now I can walk around my scene and let it render. Of course, your mileage will vary on how quick that renders as well, but we start to get a feel of how the level might look by just walking around in Blender. However, this is the main crux. Why have we assembled it like this? Well, now we can start to notice a few potential issues. Because we haven't modeled any corner pieces, when we go ahead and put these together, they slot together and overlap in these areas here on the inside edges, and if it matters, which it may not do, we end up with these gaps where it doesn't. And the same's true of the floor. But remember, in a game, if you're never seeing the outside of an object, you probably find you wouldn't even have these faces here. We'd just delete them altogether. But in this particular case, we want the option of perhaps looking on the outside. So we will have to model some corner pieces to slot in, whether it's on the inside or the outside. Now, just bear in mind when you do that sort of thing, if you do that sort of thing, you'll need to bear in mind if you add in a 2x2 piece, that suddenly your 4x4 pieces on the floor won't work very well, or have the potential to not work as well as they could do. Now, these wall pieces here are very bland at the moment, but they can soon be spruced up with a couple of textures, which we'll get to texturing really soon. But it is really important to test your models out and make sure things are working as expected. The big issue that I have currently is these inside walls. These inside walls here, you can see this shading, this horrible Z fighting, that will look horrendous in a game. And you've probably seen it even in AAA games from time to time. You just get a bit of geometry intersecting and you have this horrible hashed effect where it can't decide which one of the surfaces it needs to render. In this particular case, this really stands out as a good example of what not to do because it's got it in these four corners here. And this really does accentuate it. It won't look so bad in some of the other rendered modes, but it could potentially cause you a real headache when rendering. And the last thing you'd want to do is render out a scene or think your models are absolutely fine, only to find that later they're not and you've got to make a ton of changes. Now's the time to catch those issues and solve them. Okay, so that's it for this lecture. I'm really looking forward to your mock-ups, your designs, seeing how you're putting things together. Feel free to play with your design and come up with some new ones. Really looking forward to seeing your work, sharing the discussions, and I'll see you all in the next lecture. Hello everybody and welcome back. This is going to be a quick lecture on creating your own shortcuts. Now we're not going to go as far as doing any Python coding, but we can very easily, if you're constantly using the same menu item, you can often link it to a keyboard shortcut. In fact, sometimes it may be that your favorite keyboard shortcut has changed. So for instance, earlier on in the last lecture, we were going to view, navigation, scrolling down here, walk navigation, and it doesn't have a keyboard shortcut listed next to it. It does in fact have a keyboard shortcut. How would we know about it? Well, there is a big long list of these under Edit, Preferences, and if we go to the key map option, we have every single keyboard shortcut you can think of in all of these drop downs. Now, you're probably not going to go through all of these individually. However, at the very top there is a search box, and there's a drop down at the top where you can even go back to the old style of selection if you wanted to, and keyboard shortcuts. I'm not going to do that though, because that will confuse everybody. But this search box here is really useful. If I type in walk, we get a series of options, one of which is the view navigation. We can see here it's a keyboard shortcut, shift, and what looks like an apostrophe. It's not, it's the grave key. It's on a lot of keyboards next to the one beneath the escape key. So if I go back to my 3D view here and go shift and the grave key, I now have my first person view. I can turn on gravity and I can walk around my scene, which is pretty awesome. However, if that wasn't an option for you, how do you go ahead and create your own? Well, the keyboard shortcut key for this used to be Shift and F, and I still reach for that to this day. But if we wanted to enable that again, providing it doesn't already do something else, which it might do, so be careful, you can ruin Blender doing this, or certainly your experience of it. If we go to View, go to Navigation, go to where we want, in this case the walk navigation, in my case anyway, and right click. we can assign a shortcut. Press a key, Shift and F. Look at that, it even comes up now on that context. So I can now go Shift and F, and once again, my desire to have Shift and F be first person mode, there we go, it's there and ready. Now the great thing about first person mode is you can actually press space to jump to locations as well. And that's whether or not you have gravity turned on. Of course, you will just fall down with the gravity turned on, but it is incredibly useful. There's nothing really to focus on elsewhere. But this gives us a great way of moving around our scene, as I said in the last lecture, and, with the spacebar, at least we can come back up, we can hit tab, fly back round, and walk through the front door. So we can see there, it's very straightforward to assign your own shortcut keys. Now, I wouldn't go over the top with assigning them whilst you're new to the program, because you're really going to have to start repeating yourself multiple times. And if you find yourself going into a menu option repeatedly and selecting something, so for instance, adding the default cube, well, we can assign a shortcut to that. Perhaps Control Alt Shift and C. But do be careful, because it's very easy to overwrite the existing shortcuts if there is one already there. Now you may notice something that's a quick favourite on top. So if adding a cube is something you do very often, we can go and add to quick favourites. It doesn't seem to do anything at first, but now that we've added the cube to our quick favourites, we can just press the Q key and it will say cube. Now this is incredibly useful. There are certain things like flipping normals, merging vertices, and other things like that you can just get to really quickly from the Q menu. And it's context sensitive as well. If we're in object mode, that menu will come up. If we're in edit mode, then it won't come up because we're talking about edit operations. So later on when we come to UV unwrapping, we can see here, Edge, well, a shortcut for that is Control and E. Control and E will bring up this menu. If you find that opening up one of these all the time, perhaps marking a seam. So I could go right click, add to quick favorites. Now I can go Q, mark seam. Incredibly useful being able to do that type of quick interaction with Blender. And it's going to become more and more important. Now, these things aren't necessary in order to use Blender. However, when it comes to larger projects, being able to use keyboard shortcuts will enable you to be much more productive on those larger projects. Again, there is no right or wrong, but being able to get to a function that you use often is going to be a real incentive. In fact, that's what some of the add-ons actually end up doing. They give you options and toggles that are not easily accessible in Blender normally. Okay. That's it for this lecture. I hope you find that helpful. If you've got any tips that you want to share with others, please go into the discussions and share your favourite keyboard shortcuts. Not just the standard ones, but if you found that you've got one that's really useful, sharing it with the community is bound to help someone else out as well. I look forward to seeing those keyboard shortcuts. I may even learn something myself. And I'll see you all in the next lecture. Hello everybody and welcome back. In this lecture we're going to go over data blocks, and we'll also reinforce this knowledge over the next 4 or 5 theory and / practical lectures on data blocks and how we can move them about to different blend files. So we're going to learn about data blocks, what they are and how we can use them. Now we've actually come into contact with data blocks lots, but let's now go and explore them directly. Now they are things like mesh data, textures, objects, lights. All of these things are type of data blocks that we can move around in our scene. Now, this is very useful if you're making parts separately or bringing in other assets you've already made. So it's incredibly useful also when you're working in a team, being able to understand which data blocks are where and how you access them. So data blocks characteristics, what are they? How do we know what they are? So they must have unique names per type. That's really important. If you have something with exactly the same name, it just won't like it at all. In fact, you've seen that if you try, it will append it with 001, 002, etc. They can link to each other, which is really useful. They can link across blend files, which is also incredibly useful. And we'll talk later on about some do's and don'ts about linking across blend files. Unused data blocks are eventually removed. So we've come across this in the past with data blocks. This is where we've used fake users, so that little F symbol there, to preserve that particular data block. Because if we don't, when we go ahead and shut down the blend file and come back again, it will go. The common thing that I've seen that happen with is materials. You set up a material, you remove it from an object, you save your file, you go off, you come back, the material's gone. Now, for our basic materials that we generally work with, not a problem at all. For more advanced materials that might take hours to set up, that's quite a big problem. Sharing data blocks. So here's a quick example, and then we'll dive over into the practicals. The same texture on many materials. The same material on many meshes. We've already played with that one quite a bit. The same particle system, and so on and so on. So you're getting the gist here that we can have the same data block on multiple objects, for instance. That's incredibly useful. Sharing data means we don't have to repeat ourselves. Now, an example here is we often end up sharing and then making the data block unique. That's a given. If you've got a material that's almost there, but it's the wrong color, but you don't want to overwrite the original material, you can have another instance of that data block and then make it unique and then adjust the color to what you want. So let's go have a look at an example of this over in Blender. Okay, so now that we're over in Blender, let's go ahead and first of all, just tweak a few things because I've already turned it on once. I don't want to keep having to turn it on. So I'm just going to make this area here wider so I can see everything along the header bar for the outliner. Helps you guys out. I'm also going to go to the filters tab and turn back on these two, the disabling viewports and the render icon, and then I'm going to go across to File, go to Defaults, and save the startup file. Then I don't have to do that ever again, which is really useful. In fact, I might pull up the timeline ever so slightly. It's very tempting to get rid of the timeline, but every time I end up cleaning it away, I often end up needing it. Okay, so that's down there. I'm happy with the setup here. Let's have a look at our data blocks. The first thing we can do actually to reveal all of the data blocks that are currently in this file is to go to the display mode of the outliner and select Blender file. If we have a look at this area here, let's just make it larger, we can see all of the current data blocks that are within this file. And you can see that there are quite a few. And of course, many of these we can link into other blend files, and we'll do that in the next lecture. But let's have a closer look at how Blender manages these. And let's go to one of the ones we deal with day in, day out, so we don't have to think too much about the details of it. Let's have a look at objects, type of objects in our scene. Let's go to a cube. A cube has mesh data, so this is the data block, and then we have our material data block. Pretty awesome, hey? And you'll notice that it kind of coincides with our options that we have down here. We have our object properties, we have our modifier properties, particle properties, etc. as we go down. And then we have our object data properties, so the data properties, and then our material properties as well. So let's have a look at some of the things that we discussed in the slides just beforehand. Let's go ahead and duplicate our cube. Now, the moment we duplicate it, we can shove it anywhere in the scene, it doesn't matter. We can now see in this hierarchy, we have cube 001 and cube. Now, when we created that new cube, it also had a material on it because it was a duplicate of the original. So all of this is duplicate data. However, it's not necessarily shared data at this point in time. If we go back to the original one and go Alt-D instead, which is a linked duplicate, we've not used in a while, but now if we look at cube 002 and open that up, we can see that it shares cube and material. So looking at these and following the rules that we've already learned, that any particular type of data block's name has to be unique, we can say for certain that these three cubes share the same material. If you modify that material, it will affect all three of them. We can prove that simply by going into the viewport shading tab, going to our material. It doesn't matter which cube we're on, and let's just change it to green. They all change because they all have the same material. Now, if we go to one of these materials and rename it, let's say green, it also renames all of the others because it's the same data block. It's not unique. Now let's have a look at the names here. I'm going to get rid of one of my cubes here. I'm going to get rid of cube 002, just to make things a little simpler. Okay, so we have cube and cube 001. Now if we were to go ahead to cube 001 and try and call it cube, you're left kind of scratching your head there going, well, did they just change positions? But no, we can have a look here. Cube 001 has been successfully renamed cube. But the original cube, because two data blocks cannot have the same name, has been renamed cube 001. So if we do the same thing again, you will see they switch back, and the only way we can really tell is because of the different mesh data names underneath. So those can be named independently, which is awesome. One thing to bear in mind is case sensitivity comes in. So cube, all in capitals, or all lowercase, is a different name. They are literally different. So that's one thing to bear in mind, that case does matter. Now, what we can do with data blocks, for instance, let's make both of these share the same data. So I'm going to go back to calling this one cube. So we've got our cube 001. Oh, no, look, they're out of sync. How do we go ahead and solve that? Well, I'm just going to go up to this top one and call it cube, and it will flip back around. Okay, so we've got cube 001 and cube. Now, if I want these to have the same mesh data, which is useful, which means like if I go ahead and grab this vertex here and just move it somewhere random, just so we know it's different, we can see that this one here, cube 001, has not inherited that. However, if we go to our mesh data properties, we can change the mesh data for the cube, the one that we currently have selected, cube 001, to the cube. And there we go. It now has the same mesh data. And we can see that as well in the hierarchy because they both have the same name. And now we can see all of this data in front of us. It starts to become clear what this number 2 is next to our mesh data name. It means there are 2 users of that data block. If we click on that 2 or any other number, it makes the mesh data unique again, which means we can move it around and it won't affect the other one. Pretty awesome. Of course, we can come back in at any point and set it back to the cube. Can't do it whilst we're still editing, of course. But now I can flick between those 2 states. However, look here, we've got a 0 next to cube and cube 002. These are 2 mesh data blocks that currently have no assignment. There are no objects in our scene that are using that data. Now what this means is that if we go ahead and save our scene, and let's call this data blocks, just for short, and let's correct the capital A there. If we go ahead and save that and then revert the file, right, let's have a look. We've got our 2 unused data blocks. If we go file and revert, which is the same as opening it up again, those unused data blocks have gone. Now, that's not usually an issue, but where I have seen an issue several times is when you're playing about with materials. So we go ahead, we can see here that the green material is on both of these objects. And let's go ahead and open up our meshes, our objects again. Remember, there's a hierarchy here. Here we go. And coincidentally, you'll see that when we move an object in, its mesh data and any attached materials will also come across because they are further down that hierarchy. Now let's have a look at our material itself. On the green material here, we also have a drop down. This is similar to the mesh drop down, and we don't have any other materials in our scene at the moment. We've got the name of it, that's fine. we've got this shield. I like calling this protect, which is probably why it's got that shield there. It saves the data block even if it has no users, which is incredibly useful. It means that if I turn that off, let's say I create a new material, set this one as red, and then say, well, actually, I don't want the green material on this object anymore. Both of these will turn red. If we look at our selection of materials, now instead of having the 0 next to it, that it would have had if we hadn't enabled the fake user option, this will preserve it during saving. So this is an incredibly useful tool to be aware of. It's mainly materials that I've seen people have problems with. Okay, so what you can do as well is if the red material itself has all of the properties and everything else set up, and you want to take a copy of that material, but make it unique, but inherit all of the properties the previous material had, the next icon there, as you can see, 2 pages together, new material, add a new material, but it's going to base it upon the original material. So now we've got material 001, but the original material now has no users associated with it, something to bear in mind. And of course, you can click the X, and it unlinks the data block. Shift and click to set the users to 0. Ooh, that's a good way of cleaning if you don't want a material in the scene anymore. If I went ahead and did that, we can see on the materials list, both of these are now 0. And to really drive home the point, if I go ahead and save and revert, those materials are now gone. Eek. What happens if that material took you a few minutes or maybe even an hour to set up? When we get into materials, you can see they can get very, very complex. Okay, I'm going to set that back to green for the moment, just so they have a material applied to them. And that about wraps up our look at data blocks. Be aware that there are many in a scene. These are the things that you can link between many scenes, and you have a lot of control. Each object has to have, each data block type has to have a unique name. So whereas we can't have 2 mesh objects called cube, we can have shared data called cube, which is useful. However, if we were to make that unique by clicking the 2 there, so we now have cube 001 having unique mesh data cube 001, if we try to call that cube, just like with the mesh object, it will just rename this one down here to cube 001 because you cannot have 2 data blocks with the same name when they're the same type. Okay, that's it for this lecture. That was a bit of a deep dive into data blocks. Now, will start to become more and more clear as you start to use data blocks more and more, and this will be especially true the more advanced projects you work on. And if you have any tips on how you've managed data blocks in the past, remember to share them with everybody as well over in the discussions. That's it for this lecture, and I'll see you all in the next one. Hello everybody and welcome back. In this lecture we are going to have a look at linking across multiple blend files. So referencing other blend files is incredibly useful. It means you don't have to repeat yourself, which when you have maybe an arsenal of materials that you can access or a series of meshes, there's no point in repeating yourself time and time again if you have the information available to you. And the great thing is that any change in the source files will update the linked data. This also means if you're working in a team, say you're working on a character and someone else is working on the gun or a backpack or an axe, something that the player will be holding in your game. Now, the great thing about this is they can be modeling those other objects, and any of the changes will update when I reload my character, or certainly when I save it and then come back again. And that is really, really useful. It separates the actual parts from one another and enables a team to work on one project. So there we go. It enables multiple people to work on components of a scene. Now, we can use a relative or an absolute file structure. These are very simple concepts. Basically, in general, you're probably going to be going for a relative file system. That does mean that if you've got everything stored in a certain directory structure, it doesn't matter what computer it's on. However, an absolute file structure doesn't make much sense if you're working in a team unless you all share exactly the same file structure. It's so prone to falling apart, so I would avoid using that. Now, one of the things I will warn you about nice and early on, when you're linking, breaking a link can be an absolute pain to fix. Now, what do I mean by breaking a link? Not breaking it within Blender, but say you go ahead and move some of your files on the disk. So you go into File Explorer and you decide to rearrange some stuff. That will break, and it can be a real pain to fix. It's very difficult to just find all of those things again. Now, I say difficult because I'm assuming your project's rather large. If you've only got 2 things in there, of course it's going to be easier to relink them all. But obviously we need to avoid doing that if possible. So in general, this is why when you've decided on a file structure, and we'll talk more about that in a couple of lectures' time, it's important to actually stick with it. And you'll find that sometimes there are legacy file structures in larger organizations, in bigger projects, and that's because changing something will break the project. It's better that it doesn't look quite right as a file structure if you're not going to spend hours relinking things. Now, linking should also be one way. So let's say we've got our master scene here that we're building up. I know I've got all of my files within one blend file at the moment, which is great. It solves a lot of these linking issues. But if I wanted something else, let's say I wanted my chess set to be within my scene itself, well, we would want to link it in. I wouldn't want to have to recreate it in the scene itself. And of course, any updates I make to it, I may want those to come across as well. Okay, so let's go over into Blender now and have a look at the different ways we can link other blend files. Okay, so now that we're over in Blender, let's go ahead and create a fictitious object with some materials on it that we could bring into another file. So I'm going to call this cube here, cube to link, because that's what we're going to be, because that's what we're talking about here. We're going to link this cube into another blend file. Now, of course, you can go ahead and grab any of your other projects that you've worked on, but I'm just going to very quickly create something that's, let's make it red so we can see it. Let's turn the roughness all the way down. And if we have a look in the shaded view, it's a very shiny cube. Excellent. Let's add in one modifier and make it a very shiny ball. There we go. And I'm going to right click on it and shade it smooth. Would you look at that? I'm going to go ahead here and add one more subdivision just to smooth it out a little. Looks good. Okay, let's go ahead and save that. And I'm going to call this, let's make sure I'm in the right folder. Let's call this cube to be linked. And it's actually a ball rather than a cube. But there we go. So we've set up that blend file with a material in it that we can bring across. Okay, so now let's go ahead and create ourselves a new file. And I'm going to get rid of my default cube, as we always do. Now let's go ahead, file, create ourselves a new file and a blend file with a material in it that we can bring across. Okay, so now let's go ahead and create ourselves a new file, and I'm going to get rid of my default cube, as we always do. Now let's go ahead, file, and we've got two options. We've got link and append. Now, append is one form of linking that takes a copy, but it does not link back to the previous file. We're focused on linking. So go ahead and click on link. Let's go to where we've stored our file and go to the cube to be linked. Now, it doesn't open it up at that point. It actually opens up a series of data blocks that we can go ahead and access. Now, we could go into material and just get the material. No, we didn't name it. So it's not a particularly good name, but that's okay. For the moment, for our practice, we've got material here. Let's go ahead and grab that, add Suzanne the monkey into the scene, and then under my materials, I can select that. So we can see here, it says L0 material and shows us where it is. Now, when it goes in, we get an extra icon. We can see we have the chain icon there. And if we hover over that, you can see you can actually break the link and make it local at that point. But we'll talk about making it local later on. And now we've got Suzanne the monkey with that material on, which does mean, and I want to demonstrate this for you now, we're going to save this. I'm just going to call it Suzanne linked. And now we can go ahead back into our cube to be linked, change the color on that. So let's change it from this red to a green, just for an example. File save. Then when we go back into our other file, Suzanne linked, it automatically updates what we had before. Pretty awesome being able to do that. Now notice that the material is grayed out. It means that we cannot edit it at all. If we try and rename it, we cannot do that as well. Now interestingly, the warning I gave you about breaking links earlier, if we renamed our cube to be linked file, then it would definitely break it. So I'm not going to save that because I want to come back in here. However, if we go ahead and change the material and call this shiny green paint, which could be a valid name, save our file and go ahead and open up Suzanne linked, it also applies. So this is one of the things that you need to be careful with, because that's broken that link. So I wanted to get that in there nice and early because it's really infuriating if you didn't realize that renaming it will break the link. Of course, that's a very straightforward fix, but if you did that to many things, it'd be a real pain to do so. So I'm going to close that down there. I can go straight back into here, file, link, and this time instead of the shiny green paint, you see it's updated it there, we can go up a level and go to the object. Now what the object would do if we selected the cube to link is it would also inherit all of the extra bits below it. So not only the mesh, but the material as well. Now over on the right, there's a couple of options here. We've got relative path. This is important. I think in general, you're going to have that ticked. It just means that when you have a certain file structure on your disk, it's not reliant on it being exactly like mine is up here. It'll be all based upon the relative path based on where you've stored your data. So let's go ahead and select link. Excellent. We've got our ball in the scene, but we can't move it. Oh dear. And look, our cube to link has come in with the chain icon there as well. Now let's go down to Suzanne and go ahead and add on the shiny green paint. We've got another material in here, our material to be linked. That's not going to happen at this point in time. So a couple of things we can do. We know it's got a 0 on there, which means if we go ahead and save and revert, it will disappear. There we go, it's gone. And so's the other material that we had in our scene. So we can move Suzanne around because she is local to this scene. However, the ball that we've imported, we cannot move at all. And if we go to our modifiers tab, we can see that we can't add any additional modifiers to this either. That's locked out. We cannot rename the mesh data, the object data. We can't add new materials on either. This is completely locked and completely linked to the original object, including its position in the world. So if we were to go ahead and go to File and open up our cube to be linked, which is now really a ball, and shift it GZ4, place it 4 units on the Z axis up, save our file and go ahead and open up Suzanne linked, it's moved there as well. So you can see this is incredibly useful if you're bringing something in and all the parts are in a certain position and you don't want the other person working on your team to be able to move things around. Perhaps they're set up as a very intricate system and by moving them you could break things. That's especially true later on when you have perhaps drivers changing how another object is working. Being able to move things around can screw around with that setup. Now, one final thing I want to talk about before we go and start being able to edit some of the properties of our objects that we've linked to is that even though the chain exists here and it says it's a direct library link data block that we can make local, we cannot actually make that local at the moment because the material is further down the hierarchy. We'd have to make everything above it local first. So there we go. There's how we go ahead and link to external data blocks. Now you may be thinking, well, this is great, Mike, but I can see the use of importing materials. I can have a materials library in a blend file that I can keep referencing to and storing more and more materials in. That sounds fantastic. I can just append new materials into that whenever I want. But what use is this when I can't even move it? And with the exception of that very specific case where it has to be in a certain order. Well, in the next few lectures, we'll talk about how we can make this editable and how we can go ahead and use it in Blender. And we'll start by talking about proxies, and I'll see you in the next lecture.